Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind Gut Conversation podcast, a place to learn about breakthroughs in the science and practice of health, mind-body interactions, the microbiome, food, and the environment. Today, I have the great pleasure to talk to Emilie Berner, a chef educator and integrative health coach. Emilie received her master's degree in food studies from New York University and her health coaching certification from Duke Integrative Medicine. She trained at the Natural Gourmet Institute for Health Supportive Culinary Arts and is the chef and coordinator at New York Presbyterian Hudson Valley Hospital's Teaching Kitchen, where she also manages the organic garden. Currently, Emilie teaches at the Institute of Culinary Education in Pasadena and leads the mental fitness kitchen and coaching program at Dr. Drew Ramsey's Integrative Psychiatry Clinic. Welcome to the show, Emilie. Emilie, it's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you today. This is not going to be a conversation about science primarily. It's really something of how this interface of eating well and enjoying food supported by scientific evidence is actually good for our bodies. So really important and a topic of great interest. So let me start out with ask you something personal. So you had an illustrious career that took you from being a baker to train at some of the most prestigious U.S. teaching institutions for food studies and culinary arts, and becoming a chef instructor at the Institute of Culinary Education in Los Angeles. So the question is, how did this career start for you? What made you decide to embark on this path that ultimately made you to a prominent health coach and chef?
Well, thank you so much for, first of all, having me on this podcast, and I feel so humbled and honored to be here with you and be able to connect with all of your listeners. So thank you. And it's thanks to my teachers. I think I've had fabulous teachers throughout my journey. I think if I looked a little bit further back, there's no sort of definitive starting point. I think that origin story maybe even starts when I was a kid and cutting up fruit salads and all of the oohs and ahs that garnered when you presented a beautifully cut orange or something like that, and just the impact that cooking food had on my loved ones and community was really an internal motivator at a young age. I think I was very fortunate to volunteer in 2008 for a program called the Sylvia Center in New York as an assistant to a chef. And I was a teenager, and they have an incredible mission. They were teaching young people about the connection between food and health through cooking classes. And one day the chef just didn't show up. So I was this teenage assistant, and all of a sudden I found myself in a room full of other young kids and teens, and I had to teach the class because there was no chef instructor that day. So that was the first time where I really witnessed the power of commensality, of eating together, cooking together, and the connectedness that comes with that, and the humanity really that can create. I think there were a few other sort of formative moments around the same time. I don't know if you remember the documentary Food Inc.
Yeah.
Do you remember that one? Yeah, and that came out around that time. That really lifted the veil on the American food system and kind of blew my mind. So from there, I just like everybody that watches a food documentary, it's like, well, now do I eat vegan, or do I do this, or do I do that? And so I practiced a vegan diet for a little while. And what that did was, instead of being more restrictive, which usually is what people think of when they think of a vegan diet. They think of like cutting everything out. It expanded my culinary skills because all of a sudden I had to learn to cook things like tempeh and lentils and things that I wasn't familiar with before. So, so that I would say that documentary really was a catalyst for my sort of expanding my culinary skills. And then I didn't study any of this in college. I studied there's so many people on my path who in college they studied nutrition and they studied, things having to do with food. I studied poetry. It was nothing to do with food. Although I sort of think that maybe food and poetry are somewhat related in that they're like these little wormholes that lead you into these connected systems and always lead you back to nature in some way. But I studied poetry and I didn't really want to be a chef, but I applied to culinary school thinking that, I've got to eat, I've got to feed the people around me. I might as well find a way to do that that's healthy and delicious. So that's sort of what brought me into culinary school in 2012, and then the coaching piece really came later. That came during the pandemic. I was working at New York Presbyterian Hospital and leading their teaching kitchen there, and I found that many patients would come to cooking classes and still struggled to implement what they learned. So I became really curious about, what's going on there. How can we better support our patients? We can't really just assume that just because we show someone how to make something delicious, they're going to do it. Some will, but we really need to figure out, what are the unique barriers and challenges that people are facing that kind of inhibit them from cooking and doing that.
So, I mean, just for me to understand this, and I have to explain, even though my history of origin goes back to to my parents' business, which was a confectionery store, and making all the things that nowadays I would tell people not to consume in excessive amounts, like
Yeah.
chocolates and sweets and everything. Um, but as a gastroenterologist, I've never really been, I mean, ironically, never been exposed to diet and nutrition other than the macronutrients that you get enough protein and uh, but just to clarify this, so the difference between culinary arts and nutrition or nutritional sciences, culinary arts is really putting it into practice, is putting the nutrition science into practice. Is that correct understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where really chefs have so much power. It's taking, you know, big nutritional concepts and actualizing them, turning them into something that we can eat and enjoy. So we might have certain suggestions for, you go to the doctor and he says, you've got a heart health problem and you've got to eat this, and cut out this. A lot of people don't know necessarily how to do that. Maybe bacon's been your breakfast every day for your entire life. And then all of a sudden you're being asked to make this huge life change and you don't have necessarily the time or the resources to figure that out. So this is where teaching cooking can really be a powerful tool in supporting people on their journey to health.
So another question, sort of a technical thing. What specifically do you teach at the institute now, and who are your students? What trajectory are your students on?
Yeah. So the school that I teach at is called the Institute for Culinary Education. I graduated from the Natural Gourmet Institute, and they closed their doors a few years ago, but their whole curriculum was purchased by the Institute for Culinary Education. So I'm now teaching at the culinary school that I went to 10 years ago, just in a different school. But what we really teach is in the program that we're doing, which is a plant-based program, because there are several different tracks that you can take in culinary school. The plant-based program, which is soon actually going to have a virtual option. So if chefs can't attend in person in California or in New York, they can attend from their home kitchen. So we're really developing that now. It's really exciting. But our topics cover everything from quite classical, canonical culinary techniques, but also food philosophies like macrobiotics and Ayurveda. And we go deep into nutrition education and really encourage our chefs to understand chronic diseases and their roots. We also teach them about our food systems. We teach them about endocrine health, heart health, diabetes. We really so many different aspects of health and wellness that traditional culinary schools don't go into. So it's a fantastic program. I'm super grateful to all of my teachers that have paved this path for me. This would not have existed without all of their work. So
Yeah,
it's a great
it sounds
program.
wonderful. So are most of the students on a trajectory to become chefs? Is that the most likely outcome?
Yeah, so many of them want to become chefs, but there's also a subgroup that want to become health coaches or personal chefs or work with individuals in different ways. There are chefs that want to become educators, that want to work in community health centers, that want to work in teaching kitchens in different, different kind of health sector um, or different places. So there's quite a variety of, what the students want to do with this degree, but, they all have a same passion for nutrition and health and sort of how those things interact.
It's certainly something badly needed. I mean, sort of you're sort of operating in between the extremes. On the one side, chefs without any education about the science and health, making the unhealthiest food, and then on the other hand, what I often call snake oil sellers, or
Mhm.
even worse, charlatans who come up with all kinds of recommendations that are not science evidence based, and a lot of people fall for that because it seems like, I mean, the common question I get from patients or people that I talk to, whom should we believe? There's so many voices out there. I mean, which diet is best for me? And so something like that program that you're describing is something really badly needed. I think, that you bridge
Yeah.
this gap between these extremes.
And I think that, one of the things that we're told as consumers is we have the power to vote with our forks, right? So what we choose to put on the end of our fork and into our bodies, that's a vote for a specific thing in our food system, right? And when I think a little bit more deeply about this, I think that, you know, well, who creates the food at the end of your fork? If you're at a restaurant or, out in the world, it's a chef. So chefs are really creating the ballot that we vote on.
Mhm.
So there's so much power that chefs hold to transform entire food systems. And, one of the things that we work with our students on is what are you going to put on your menus? Our slogan is find your culinary voice. What are you going to choose to put on your menus and why, and what does that say about your values as
Mhm.
a chef? So it's a very unique position to be in, and a powerful one at that. So I think there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that.
Yeah, you never really would think about this or would have thought about this in the past, the power that chefs have, because this ethical framework that they're using to navigate and to recommend things, it ranges from, our behavior towards animals, our concern for human health, to the environment. I mean, it's not just making, a delicious um, plate, in a restaurant, in a fancy restaurant. It's all these other factors. And the good thing is, I mean, there are some individuals now that really practice that art, which, I'm sure I mean, there's restaurants and there's chefs that practice this kind of culinary art.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to your point that you were getting at a little bit earlier of how do we kind of navigate the confusing information that's out there, and how can consumers figure out really what's best for them. um, I think that's a really complicated question. I think, many of us suffer from a kind of paralysis that comes from a perfectionist culture. Foods become something that we fear. We're told that wild salmon is good to eat. So we run to the store and we spend our hard earned dollars on wild salmon. But then simultaneously, we may learn something like, oh, there are microplastics in fish, and that makes fish something to fear. So we don't know what to do anymore as consumers, and we get paralyzed. You either get paralyzed or we kind of throw up our hands and give up altogether and, buy the bag of whatever's convenient and expensive. So I think, where it takes time and energy to learn about these things, and not everybody has the time and energy. So I understand that part, but I would encourage folks, when they do have a moment, to just check sources on studies, dig past the headline, find the original studies, who funded them, are those parties neutral, are they biased? I think the field of nutrition is dynamic and changing all the time. And so when we're thinking about, what to eat and what's best, one of my favorite food authors is Michael Pollan, like many,
Mhm.
like many, and he simplifies everything in his suggestion that we eat food, not too much, and mostly plants.
Mm.
And I would really add to that, let's find ways to make food our friend again. It's one of life's greatest pleasures. And I hope that as chefs and consumers, we can create plates of possibility where, good can be good enough and we don't have to get so quagmired in, is this okay? Am I okay? What am I doing? And all of that, and find our way back to a balance there.
Yeah, sort of, this topic that you mentioned, these food related fears, coming to another quote from Michael Pollan, that we're living in this national eating disorder, problem. Um, I'm not sure if that really exists to the same degree in other countries. I mean, I've grown up in southern Germany, where that just, there's a culture, not necessarily the healthiest food culture, but there are a lot of healthy things, natural products, in addition to the unhealthy parts like the sausages and things. But there was a tradition, sometimes going back hundreds, or if you go to Italy, thousands of years, Romans, or in southern France. And so these countries have it a lot easier. I mean, they grow up from their childhood on in a in a culture that has anchored, certain foods and dietary habits, for a long time. In the U.S., there's not such a thing. There's maybe steak and potatoes, or turkey. And I think this is the main problem in the US, that you don't have a basis, an anchor that people can say, okay, we've eaten, my ancestors have eaten this, and then often the immigrants forget what they used to eat. I mean, some keep it for a generation, but then they forget it, and then they're thrown into this relentless, fear of not eating this or eating this, and um, if you look at packages now, there's more labels on it, what's not contained in it, than what's contained in it, which is a good expression of that. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't see an end to this. I mean, it's sort of, uh, I use a simplistic way. On the one side, I look at the science constantly, but then I also look at the evidence for something as, well known as the traditional Mediterranean type diet, not necessarily the modern Italian diet, which is not that healthy, but um, and so here you have something that I think that is tasty, that everybody could stick to, but then there's these other voices that go up to, oh, you have to go on the keto diet and you can't eat this, and and so it's really in the US, it's a challenge for the consumer to really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the Mediterranean diet is one of the diets that has the most evidence kind of supporting its health benefits. I actually like to say this isn't really a diet, it's more of a lifestyle, and one that, of course, involves healthy food groups, but it promotes movement, it promotes purpose, community, spirituality, interconnectedness. But I really think all sort of what you're saying, all cultural food needs to be celebrated. There are many traditional foods that are wonderfully healthy for us, and they just haven't been researched to the same extent as the Mediterranean diet has. So I would even venture to hypothesize that if more traditional foods were studied, we would find similar results across cultures.
Yeah, and I mean, along the same lines, I'm on the same wavelength. I mean, often I wonder if these other factors that you mentioned, the spiritual and community, particularly the physical exercise. I mean, every time we go to Italy, we do experience these. Like check your iPhone and you walked 8 miles during the day, and you go out for dinner, and the places, the streets and the piazzas are packed with people and walking around and socializing. It's all these things that really don't exist here anymore, and so I often wonder if these factors are at least as important as actually the composition of the diet, quite honestly. It sounds crazy for somebody who has spent so much time thinking about this, but if I didn't have the personal experiences, and we did a recent trip to Parma, I was invited, and it's not a very healthy diet in Parma, even though they're a UNESCO heritage site for diet. There's lots of ham, there's lots of cheese, Parmesan cheese, and but then I looked at the life expectancy of people in this region of Italy, the Emilia-Romagna region, and it's not different from Sicily.
Yeah.
In Sicily they would eat a very different diet, a lot of fish, and not the same kind of. So yeah, I think we're so obsessed now with just looking at the macronutrients in the diet, and that we've sort of forgotten all these other factors that are really an essential part. And you mentioned this beautifully. I mean, it's great to hear this from from somebody who's really in the trenches, and
Yeah.
teaching
I
this.
mean, I don't think what you're saying is crazy at all. I mean, I think there's data to suggest the impacts that stress has on our appetites, on our systems, on how we digest food and process nutrients. There's that proverb. I think a crust eaten in peace is better than a banquet partaken in anxiety. So this idea that when we are in a state of rest and digest, and our parasympathetic nervous system is activated, and we're better able to process and digest nutrients and absorb material from our food. So there's hard science behind that, and it's really super important. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So let's stay a little bit with this topic. So a large number of people are, as you know, on this constant quest to lose weight. I mean, that's another obsession I think that people have, and they evaluate their diets primarily based on the effectiveness for weight loss. I mean, the ketogenic diet is a good example for that. People know it's not the healthiest, but it's the fastest way to lose weight. And so do you promote any specific weight loss diet, or any elimination diet, or do you teach the lifestyle with the kind of Mediterranean or vegan diet that would have this as an automatic byproduct or side effect that you lose weight?
Yes. So I had the great pleasure of attending the Healthy Kitchens, Healthy Lives conference this past week, and heard Walter Willett speak, who's a professor of epidemiology and nutrition at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And he suggests that obesity and diabetes are symptoms. They're symptoms of a societal structure and food system. So along those lines, I think it's really difficult to promote a single weight loss diet because we're all human, but we're also very different. So, and our reasons for gaining weight are different. One person may have a thyroid issue. One person, may have emotional distress. It really depends on the person. So when I work with my patients, losing weight is really a side effect, and improving health is the goal.
Yeah. Walt Willett's obviously an amazing guy in his publications. I've sort of been a big fan, and once interviewed him. So yeah, he's really. I share your enthusiasm for him.
Inspirational leader. Yeah. Yeah.
So another question. So you work closely with one of the most well-known experts in nutritional psychiatry, Dr. Drew Ramsey. That's how we got to know each other, through him. It's kind of a rhetorical question. How effective do you think that nutritional interventions are for common psychiatric diseases, or do you really see it as an adjuvant component of dealing with the whole person that has a psychiatric disease?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting space to watch. I think one of the things about that's unique about our clinics is we have a therapist that our patients can work with alongside Dr. Ramsey, who's a psychiatrist, and then also if they want to bring in a food component, they can work with me. So when it comes to mental health, there's little evidence really that suggests that there are specific diets that are gonna work for psychiatric disorders. There are some really great studies about vitamin D and depression, among others. Dr. Ramsey would be a wonderful expert to ask more about those unique studies. So there is some material there, but in our clinic, we really focus on food categories. So leafy greens, what he calls the rainbows, which is like all of the fruits and vegetables and colorful foods, seafood, and then we kind of lump together like nuts, seeds, and legumes, and probiotic rich foods. So we've sort of noticed that patients that include these food groups, while minimizing hyper processed and hyper palatable foods, they may have improved health outcomes and the efficacy of their medications may be improved as well. So there's some, more, it's not heavily researched, I think, but there's some interesting research that's starting to happen. There are more papers coming out about specifically about bipolar and keto, but it's still quite a new space. I mean, the space of nutritional psychiatry is quite new. So more to come, hopefully, on that.
Yeah, and I'm sure that will. I mean, psychiatry is sort of on the verge of a revolution, both in terms of diet and in terms of psychedelics. So, in 10 years from now, psychiatry may be something totally different in terms of therapeutic options that physicians, that psychiatrists can use. So, yeah, I fully agree. And it's also interesting how, how we learned, we haven't really talked about the microbiome, something that I'm particularly interested in, how the microbes have this ability to participate in the metabolism of many of the psychiatric drugs. It's another interesting thing, that depending on how you eat and what diet you have, you may actually have different plasma levels of certain medications, psychiatric medications. And so this is a new field, and I think it's exciting. A little bit too early, I would say, to make specific recommendations, but certainly the potential is great.
Yeah, I agree.
A sort of related question along the same lines. I mean, how important do you think the standard American diet, always like that acronym SAD, has in the prevalence of anxiety and depression? So we've seen a 25% increase of anxiety during the pandemic in the last couple of years. Even though the diet probably hasn't changed that dramatically during those last 2 years. It may for some people, but so how important a factor do you think that is in
Yeah, I mean, gosh, it's a big question. I think that there are indicators that the SAD diet may be linked to the prevalence of anxiety and depression. I think, one of the most interesting spaces to watch here is the impact of food and the microbiome, like you were just talking about. And this is really where our two worlds meet,
yeah.
is in the gut. And it's we harbor, as you know, we harbor trillions of microbes. And I learned from another doctor, Dr. Sean Spencer, who's a gastroenterologist. You may know him, over in Stanford, that when we eat things that include fiber, they're munched on by these microbes, and they make microbial metabolites that pass into our circulation, and these are actually relevant to our physiology. So you probably know way more about this than I do, but that the SAD diet, because it's pretty devoid of fiber, it starves our microbes, and we miss out on these metabolites. So and what he's studied and looked at is, in this fiber deficient state, the mucus layer of the gut thins, and then when we don't feed that, it feeds on us. So you probably know this better than anyone, but that creates essentially, it creates inflammation in the absence of fiber. So there's a dramatic impact of the microbiome on our physiology, just from, we know it already from influencing our immune system, our metabolism, our central nervous system. So I think, there are really strong links here. It's going to be a fascinating space to watch. It already is. And the good news is that, it's malleable, and diet really gives us this important lever where we can regain some control over these systems.
Yeah, I mean, it's always nice, if you fully agree with somebody on so many things. Certainly not. I wouldn't be in that situation talking to some of my colleagues, who either completely unaware of that whole discussion, or just send their patient to a dietitian because they don't want to deal with it themselves, or they have no interest or patience to do that. So it's wonderful to talk to somebody like you who is so well educated and so open-minded to a different way of looking at health, starting with diet.
Well, I would throw that right back at you. I'm on your podcast. I mean, this is the fact that you have an interest in this and you see the connection where many physicians are missing that link, or even not as curious or don't really want to know because they've just learned things a certain way, and they have 15 minutes with a patient and that's it. And they have had little to no nutritional training, and that you are exploring all of this is just so awesome and inspiring, and I'm sure super helpful to many.
I think, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. I really enjoyed this, Emilie, and I really appreciate you took the time in your office to talk to me. Hopefully, there will be many more interactions in the future, also on a practical level. But I mean, maybe one last question I want to ask you. Like in your endeavor and your efforts and what you see, what the situation is currently, what do you think we're going to be in 10 years from now in terms of diet and the impact of that on the health of the population, which has not gotten better over the last decades. If anything, it continues to get worse. The medical system is able to contain the worst complications, including death, but the diseases continue to grow in prevalence, and the dietary habits, maybe other than on the coastal areas in the US, have not really changed that dramatically. So what do you think in 10 years we're going to be?
Oh my goodness, that's a really difficult question. I mean, in California, where we are, we're probably going to be underwater, but who knows? So I think that we do have a major crisis in our population, and cooking food takes time. Food takes love. It takes skill. It takes money. And hyper palatable, convenient foods are all around us and for cheap. So, and then you add chronic disease management. That is so complex. I'm not really sure what the solution is or what's needed, but I hope that we can all start by making food our friend again, finding small ways to make these 1-degree turns, even if it's just by, adding a little more leafy green to something where you didn't have it before. I guess none of this happened overnight, right? And it's going to take time and patience and persistence and awareness and care to kind of work our way back to any form of balance. So that's my hope for all of us.
Yeah, let's hope so. So,
Mhm.
well, thanks again, Emilie. I'm looking forward to talk to you again.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute delight to be here.